Hey there, MainStagers. I'm the MainStage Guru. The first step to building a bulletproof MainStage rig is making sure you have the right computer. In this episode, we're going to clear up that confusion. Stand by, here it comes. Your computer will likely be the single most expensive investment for your MainStage rig. This part is huge because the choice of hardware is going to directly affect your experience. Going cheap here can cause a lot of disappointment very quickly. So let's talk today about computer choices and how those choices affect MainStage's performance. One thing before we get started, I want to let you know I am not endorsed by any computer manufacturer, any instrument manufacturer, any controller manufacturer, or anything else. I'd like to be endorsed, but I'm not. So the information that I give here is my personal opinion and my personal experience on creating MainStage rigs for live performances. So what does MainStage require to run? MainStage is a pretty complex real-time program that creates sound on demand based on electronic inputs from physical controllers. In order to do this, MainStage requires three major things from the host computer. So the first thing is your CPU. The CPU provides all the horsepower to output sounds nearly instantaneously. Processing speeds and the number of performance cores that can process information at the same time determine the amount of sound that can be produced. Therefore, processor speed and the quantity of processor performance cores directly determines how much can be produced by the program with a minimum amount of latency. The second item is RAM, or random access memory. RAM provides space for the program to run efficiently. It also provides storage for the instant playback of sample data used by sampler instruments. More RAM in a system means there can be more code that can be processed immediately. More RAM also means data required by the program needs to be moved from the hard drive to RAM less frequently. We'll get into more of that here in a second. Lastly is hard drive space. The SSD drives provide mass storage of programs and sample data used by MainStage after it's swapped into RAM. It also provides virtual memory or virtual RAM, which is a place that is targeted by the OS for quick access, called RAM swapping. So in general, the speed of the processor and the amount of performance cores inside that processor determines how large of a MainStage concert you can run effectively before you have issues. The more RAM you have, the more efficiently code can be stored for use by the processor and the less RAM swapping that has to occur. The more SSD space you have, the less likely you are to run out of space, especially virtual memory, which is required for RAM swapping. It could also be noted that SSD drives have finite read-write cycles, so a large drive will actually last longer as it has more space to use when drive cells become damaged or unusable. Okay, so having said all that, which Mac should I consider or avoid? The Mac line is actually consolidated a bit since the introduction of the M-series processors, and of course there are some minimum requirements that need to be met. However, you need to remember that minimum specs will provide minimum functionality. While I'll discuss the minimum specifications here in a second, I'll also discuss what I would recommend to my MainStage consulting clients who are building keyboard rigs requiring 100% uptime. And while we're here, let's discuss one other thing that's worth considering when purchasing your computer. The more you purchase today, the longer that investment is going to last. As an example, back in 2012, I purchased an 8-core server spec Mac Mini for my MainStage rig. It had 8 processor cores, 16 gigs of RAM, and a 2 terabyte SSD. That computer was totally overkill and quite expensive when I purchased it, but it lasted nearly 12 years before I had to replace it. When you amortize the cost of that computer over 12 years, I spent less than $110 a year for it. Consider that when making your choices. So what does Apple recommend for MainStage? Well, Apple's specs for MainStage are identical to those for Logic Pro. As of MainStage 3.7 and Logic Pro 11.2, those specs are Mac OS 14.4 and higher, 6 gigs of available storage space for minimum installation, or 72 gigabytes of storage space for full sound library installation. 8 gigs of RAM is the practical minimum, with 16 gigabytes or more strongly recommended for a better experience. And you can find that information directly on the system requirements for Logic Pro. Okay, let's start with what not to consider. The used market is flooded with quite powerful Intel machines, but for all intents and purposes, Intel Macs are no longer supported products. There will be no more OS or software updates targeted for Intel Macs, and any software upgrades that will work on Intel Mac will do so only because the upgrade is not specifically required for an M-series processor. So personally, I would not consider or recommend any Intel Mac at this point due to the fact that it's no longer upgradable or supported. Okay, next would be the MacBook Air line. This is an attractive entry point product for Macintosh computers. That being the case, many people are using or attempting to use MacBook Airs as a MainStage machine. And for projects that only require a minimum MainStage implementation, the machines can be useful and work. However, there are some downsides to consider, and this is important. The process of taking physical inputs from a keyboard and processing audio data at near real time requires a substantial amount of processing power. That processing power creates heat in the processor, and too much heat can damage the processor. In the MacBook Pro and Mac Mini lines, there's a cooling fan that keeps the processor cool. But in the MacBook Airs, the only protection is to throttle the processor to keep it from overheating. The good news is M-series processors run substantially cooler than their Intel counterparts. The bad news is, if this was ever to happen, processor throttling could adversely affect a MainStage session or bring it down completely. In that case, I would never recommend a MacBook Air for use in a professional MainStage application. Okay, so how do I choose the right computer for my needs? So for my touring clients, I always recommend the following. Firstly, select a Mac Mini or MacBook Pro. They have all the connection ports for things like interfaces and your other connections that you're going to make to the computer. On the other hand, Mac Studios or Mac Pros are options. They're pretty expensive. And while I don't like to use the word overkill, you're likely not to ever exceed those specifications prior to the time when you're going to need a new computer. I would choose the fastest processor with the most performance cores you can afford. Choose as much RAM as you can afford, minimum of 16 gigs. And lastly, choose the largest internal SSD you can afford, minimum of 1 terabyte. External SSDs can be added for sample libraries, but programs should be installed on the internal drive. And remember that virtual memory is also applied to the internal drive. I hope this information can help you select the right computer for your MainStage rig. Remember that the more you purchase today, the less likely you are to have problems or issues, and you'll be able to use that computer longer as you upgrade and improve your MainStage concerts, add virtual instruments and other plugins, or generally work inside the MainStage environment. Don't forget to go to my website, jimquesta.com, where you can check out all of my MainStage compilations or sounds for individual songs that are available for purchase. Check those out, and if there's sounds for songs that you'd like to use, contact me and I'll see if I can put them together for you. Until next time, I'm the MainStage Guru. Thanks for watching.